today. Today we are finishing up our series called After I Do. And what we've been talking about this whole time, if you haven't been with us, what we've been talking about is how do you build up your marriage? A lot of us are good at tearing it down, but how do you build it up? And as we finish up today, today's message is actually very, very simple. And it's got a simple title and it's got a simple idea. The way you build your best marriage is to give it up. You just give it up. And when I say that, some of you kind of go all over the place thinking all kinds of different things. What do you mean give it up? It's not give up on your marriage, which this is one of these stories I'm going to tell you here in just a second that I had to check, because when I came across it, I thought, no, that didn't really happen. No, that's not really true. But as best I could find out, this is really true. A man named Larry Ripple, he lived in Kansas City. Larry Ripple goes into the bank one day with a gun. It was unloaded. It was not a loaded gun, but Larry walks into the bank and he says to the teller, there's a holdup. He goes, I want you to get all the cash you can, put it in the bag. And so, of course, they're panicked, but they've been trained for this, and she does. She grabs everything. She puts it all in the bag. She hands him the bag. And Larry takes the bag and the unloaded gun and walks over next to the security guard. He sets down the bag. He sets down the gun. He walks away, and then he sits on the other side of the security guard, and he waits for the police to get there. Everybody's kind of like, this is really weird. Is he going to do something? Is he going to bomb? What's going on here? And the police show up, and the police finally arrive, and they come, and they walk in, and they arrest him, and they start talking to the teller and the security guy. They go, no, he's really pleasant. He didn't, he never really threatened anybody. He walked in, he took the money, and he sat down. And so one of the police officers finally just asked him, sir, what's going on? What are you doing here? What's your agenda? And he said, I couldn't go back home to her, and I figured being in jail was better than being with my wife. I was like, Larry has given up, right? Larry just gave up. I would rather be in prison than work on my marriage with her, okay? And that's not what we're talking about when we talk about giving up. We're actually talking about something else. We're talking about this idea of sacrifice. That giving it up really means I'm giving whatever it is up that is blocking progress in my marriage. And this can happen in a lot of ways, and it shows up all over the place. So this is nothing new. I mean, this isn't a new idea, but it may be a new idea for you. It may be something that you've never really thought about or that you've never really explored. And I'll be honest with you, when it comes to a marriage, it's two people, right? And it's always two people. So one person may be willing to sacrifice and another person isn't, and that's a problem. It really is. But when you have two people that are willing to sacrifice for each other, that's when the marriage soars. That's when it just takes off and it becomes something completely different, something completely better. And I think if you're married especially, that's exactly what you want. If you're thinking about getting married, that's the kind of marriage you want. And maybe, and I'm not trying to create a sore spot or anything, but maybe if you look back on a marriage that didn't work and you realize, that would have been a big key. That would have been an important thing in my life. And so giving up in your marriage actually builds your marriage. Now, through this series, we've talked about several things. We talked about the very first week, we talked about this idea that ultimately one of the things that matters most when it comes to your marriage and it being successful is making sure that you are putting your expectations in the right place. That you're putting the weight of expectations onto Jesus, not onto your spouse, because your spouse can't carry those. We talked about that. Last week, Pastor Corey did a phenomenal job talking about how you fight in your marriage, because when you put two people together, they are going to fight. There's no way to get around that. There's going to be some fighting going on. And so he talked about what it looks like to fight well in your marriage. So dealing with expectations and fighting. And today, we're talking about sacrifice. But as I was getting ready today, and I was thinking about things, I came across a quote, and I thought, this is perfect. It's the perfect description, because sometimes people are guilty of talking about marriage like it's way too easy. They pretend like it's not that hard. If you'll just do these 3 steps, everything will be great. And that's not true. And other times, people kind of present it almost as if you'll never overcome it. It's always going to be hard. You might as well just resign yourself to being miserable. And that's not true either. The truth is somewhere in between, that it's really good, but it's really hard. And Gary Smalley, who's been doing this kind of stuff, he's been working with people and marriages as a counselor, as an author, as a speaker, all kinds of stuff for over 35 years. And he said this, which I thought was so insightful and so helpful. And so I want to read this quote to you. He says, most marital difficulties center around one fact, that men and women are totally different. Most of you are going like, yeah, I live with one, right? Yeah, they are. They were totally different on the day they married, and they are totally different today. The differences emotionally, mentally, and physically are so extreme that without a concentrated effort to understand and work together, it's nearly impossible to have a happy marriage. And I think if you're in a marriage, or you're in a a relationship where there's been some difficulty, you realize what he's saying. You got to be intentional. You've got to be intentional. There's no way for it to work unless you're intentional. You have to focus on this. And I know the reason why this is so hard. Because most of us would like, do you remember the old Ronco commercials? Anybody? You remember the Ronco commercials? He sold all these crazy appliances and he had a catchword. You set it and forget it, right? You just turn it on and it magically does whatever it's supposed to do. A lot of us felt like our marriage was going to be that way, right? I was just going to get married and set it and forget it because, if we're meant to be, it's going to be great and it's always going to be fine. It's going to be easy and we're going to love each other and we're always going to be happy. But it's not, and it doesn't. You have to be intentional. Building your marriage on Christ. That's what builds your best marriage. Building your marriage on Christ. That's what builds your best marriage. Because when you look at other things and look for it to other ways, it just doesn't work. It just doesn't happen. Now, obviously, Scripture tells us a lot about marriage, about what it should look like. It talks about a lot of concepts that work not only in a marriage relationship, but honestly, any relationship. And so in a minute, we're gonna look at a passage. If you got a Bible with you, we're gonna look at 1 Peter. But I wanna call you back to something. Maybe you've seen this before. It's this triangle. This triangle. That's really the focus of any marriage. It's this triangle. And you see at the far ends are the husband and the wife. And at the center point is Jesus. We talked about this in the very first week. That for so many people, when they think about their marriage is, I'm gonna do all the things that make me happy. And I'm gonna live with my spouse. And my spouse should get along and go along and everything should be fine. I'm gonna do my best life and live my truth. My spouse is gonna do their best life and live their truth and everything will be great, except it never is because you never end up in the same place. But when you live on that triangle, some amazing things happen. If you make it your focus and your intention to follow Jesus, what happens is, as you do that and your spouse does that, you're not even doing it on purpose, but you're getting closer and closer together because you're both going to the same place. And that is the model that the Bible holds up as the right, the good, the perfect marriage. But it's intentional. It's two people making the decision that I'm gonna move towards Jesus. And as I move towards Jesus, I also know, I understand that I'm gonna move closer to my spouse. And so we've used that as kind of the foundation for everything we've talked about over these last 4 weeks. But today, as we look at 1 Peter, he tells us this idea of giving it up is so central to making this marriage relationship work, and hold on, if you're not married, to make any relationship work. Because what Peter does is he starts off real kind of high level. He in essence says, look, if you're gonna enjoy your life, if you're gonna live your best life, if you're gonna have meaningful relationships, if you're gonna look back and say it to yourself that even though I've had some hard times, even though I've had some bumps, I'm really satisfied with my life. I feel like God has blessed me. I feel like I'm getting everything I'm supposed to get out of life. He says it only happens one way. It only comes with following Jesus. And so in one sense, this is relationship advice, but really in a bigger sense, this is life advice, no matter what kind of relationships that you have. So if you've got a Bible or you're in the app, we're in 1 Peter chapter 5. And in 1 Peter, he tells us something that a lot of us already know. He says, if you're gonna follow Jesus, you're gonna have to give up some things. And for a lot of people, that's a big negative, but for Peter, I don't think it's a negative. And so let's look at what he says in 1 Peter chapter 5, verses 6 through 8. He says it this way. He says, humble yourselves, therefore, under God's mighty hand, that he may lift you up in due time. Cast all your anxiety on him because he cares for you. Be alert and of sober mind. Your enemy, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion looking for someone to devour. Stop there. I know that seems a little ominous. Like there's like a lion chasing me, that I'm like prey or something to this enemy. And he says you have to give up some things. Like I said, and this is Brett, okay? This isn't out of the Bible, this is just out of Brett. I think for so many people, when it comes to following Jesus, the only thing they see, the only thing they hear is all the stuff I gotta give up. I gotta give up this, I gotta give up control, I gotta give up this behavior, I gotta give up these things, I gotta give up. And that's why for so many people, it is hard to think that I would follow Jesus because I don't wanna give up all these things. And the problem is, that's only half the sentence. If you follow Jesus, you know this. Yes, following Jesus means giving up things, but you get back better than what you give up. And Peter just proves it right here. He says, for example, if you will give up your pride, you will get back God's compassion. If you will give up your anxiety, you will get back God's care. If you will give up just kind of floating and drifting through life, God will give you back courage. He says, yes, you have to give up some things. You have to give up your pride. You have to give up your anxiety. You have to give up this idea that I'm just going to cruise through life. But if you give those things up, what you get back is so much better. It's the life that you've been wanting. Again, it doesn't make everything easy. It doesn't make everything smooth. It just means that thing in you that wants a meaningful and full life, you get it when you follow Jesus. So yes, you give up some things, but what you get back is so much better. And then that saying, that ominous saying, he says, you have an enemy. You have an enemy. It's prowling around who wants you to check out. And I've been there. I'm going to tell you a little bit later in the message about when I checked out. But in essence, he wants you to be so busy at work, so flustered driving your kids back and forth, so consumed with stuff that when you do have some downtime, you just zone out on YouTube or TikTok. You just kind of move through life. You live with your spouse like they're a co-manager and a co-worker. And one day you wake up and you realize you have drifted away from everything you thought was important. And you've drifted into a life that's got you where you don't want to be. And I know that sounds kind of heavy. So I want to give you a moment. And you guys know about sea otters, right? You've seen these little furry little sea creatures, little sea otters. Look at that. They're holding hands. Let me hear you. 1, 2, 3. Oh, yeah. Isn't that wonderful? This is actually real. Now, sea otters, when they sleep, they hold hands. Oh, yeah, that's nice. Isn't that nice? It has nothing to do with them being friends or romantic or anything else. The people that study animals tell us this. The reason they hold hands, because sometimes it's in pairs or 3 or 4 or 5 or even 6 at a time, is because when they sleep out on the ocean, if they're not careful, they have learned that if they're by themselves, they can easily be taken by a current. And when they wake up, they're completely separated from all their little sea otter friends. They don't know where they are, and they don't know where to go. But if they stay connected, they're together. They can better navigate. They can better survive. They can look out for each other. See, why do I tell you about sea otters? When you stay connected to Christ, you don't drift through life. You don't get as anxious as everybody else. You don't have a pride problem that keeps blowing up your relationships. When you stay connected to Christ, you don't drift away. You don't wake up wondering, who's this person I married and where did God go? Instead, you stay connected to Christ, and if you're married, you find yourself growing closer in your relationship. So yes, you give up some things, but you get so much more. Connect with God and find his blessings, his care, and his courage. That is the life that you've been looking for. And like I said, this works in every relationship, whether you're married or not. But then Peter does speak to people that are married. And you have to turn your page. If you got the old school Bible, if you've got the app, it'll just be below there. But we're going to look over in 1 Peter chapter 3. And one of the things you need to know about Peter as we get ready to look at this, he was one of Jesus' first early followers. There were very few people that spent more time with Jesus than Peter did. And not only that, what's really interesting to me about Peter is Peter was married. Now, we don't know, some of the other disciples, some of the other followers of Jesus were married. Many of them weren't. We don't exactly know on a lot of them, but we do know for sure that Peter was married. And he brought a unique perspective that a lot of these other guys couldn't bring. As an early follower of Jesus, seeing Jesus all the time, walking with him, learning him, understanding him, listening to him, and also being married, connected in this important human relationship and navigating both of these things together. Peter brings a little bit different perspective than maybe other people would bring. And in 1 Peter chapter 3, he speaks to husbands and wives. And as we get ready to read this, I want to just say up front, as you hear this, depending on your background, and I want to take just a moment. If you experienced abuse personally, or you grew up in a house where this was common, when you hear this, some of this you might feel like, that's how I got into trouble. And you need to understand what Peter is doing. Peter is writing to followers of Jesus who want to have a marriage built on Christ and want to move closer to each other. And yes, there is potential in that for it to get ugly and go wrong. That is not the intention. There is potential for that in everything. It doesn't make it right. It doesn't make it good. And I want to tell you, if that was your experience, or if you grew up in that, or if you've been around that, I apologize. I wish that had not happened to you. But that doesn't cut you out from God's best. That doesn't take away from what God can and will do in your life going forward. So listen to what Peter says to wives and husbands. 1 Peter chapter 3, verse 1. He says, wives, in the same way, submit yourself to your husbands, so that if any of them do not believe the word, they may be won over without words by the behavior of their wives, when they see the purity and reverence of your life. Your beauty should not come from outward adornment, such as elaborate hairstyles and wearing of gold jewelry or fine clothes. Rather, it should be that of your inner self, the unfading beauty of a gentle and quiet spirit, which is of great worth in God's sight. For this is the way the holy women of the past who put their hope in God used to adorn themselves. They submitted themselves to their own husbands like Sarah, who obeyed Abraham and called him her Lord. You are her daughters if you do what is right and do not give way to fear. Verse 7, husbands, in the same way, be considerate as you live with your wives. Treat them with respect as the weaker partner and heirs with you of the gracious gift of life, so that nothing will hinder your prayers. Now, there's a lot here, and the first thing I want to take on is what Peter talks about. He says, if you're in a marriage where one of you is a follower of Jesus and one is not, what do you do? How does that even work? And he uses it, he says, wives, if your husband's not a follower, I don't think there's any problem flip-flopping that and saying, husbands, if you're a follower and your wife's not. He makes an important point. He said, if your spouse has heard the good news of who Jesus is, that he died for your sins, that he was raised so that you could have new life, and that if you will follow him, you can have this meaningful and full life. If your spouse knows that, they understand the faith. He then says, well, what you do is you don't try to argue, manipulate, or twist them into that faith. What you do is you simply live it out in such a compelling way that your spouse is drawn to it and says, I don't know exactly what's going on with you, but I like it, and I want the same thing. So he's saying, first of all, we model for each other in our marriage what it looks like to follow Jesus. And then he speaks directly to wives and directly to husbands. And he tells them that you do need to give up some things. And we'll look at each one in a second. And he also points out an area where we have to be careful for wives and for husbands both. And so I want to dive into this because I think these things can actually help you as you think about what does it look like to give up in my marriage? What does it look like to sacrifice? And so the first thing he says is to wives. He says, wives, you need to give up criticism for respect, give up chaos for peace, and give up straining for submission. In other words, wives, when you think about your husbands, there's a lot of stuff you could criticize. There's a lot of stuff, and probably rightfully so. But he says, instead, give that up and choose respect. He says when it comes to the idea of following along with them, that sometimes it's easy to give into this idea of drama and chaos in the home. And he says, instead, give that up. Give up drama. Choose peace. And then when it comes to who gets their way, who gets what they want, whose agenda are we going to follow? He says, give up straining. Give up working and grasping and grabbing and competing, and choose submission. Now, if you're a wife, you're kind of like, I don't like my list. I'm not sure I like my list. There's another one coming. So hang in there. But he also gives a warning. And it's not every woman, it's not every wife, but he says, be careful. Be careful. Not to confuse your identity and your worth with how you look, but with rather who you follow. He's not saying you can't look nice. We appreciate it when you look nice. We really do. He's not saying don't get dressed up. He's not saying don't take care of yourself. He's saying simply don't confuse your identity, who you are, with how you look, because you're settling for far too low of a measure. You are a daughter of the King. You are a follower of Christ, and he has become your identity. So don't get that confused with your appearance. We don't need housewives of Maricopa County, right? That's not going to help anybody, right? Instead, make it your focus to follow Jesus and find your identity in him. And then he talks to husbands. You might think, well, we got off easy, No, guys. He's got something for you too. He says, you got to give up some things. He says, give up harshness for consideration. And it's so easy. You go to work and you're around guys and do things. It's hard. It's easy to be harsh with people, harsh with your kids, harsh with your wife. And he says, no. Give that up. And instead, be considerate. How you doing? What's going on? How can I help? How you feeling? What's up today? Give up harshness for consideration. Give up neglect for respect. Oh, again, it's so easy that I got so many things and I'm tired when I get home and I got a lot of stuff and I got a lot of pressure and responsibility and it's easy to neglect the relationship. Peter says, give that up. Instead, choose to respect. And then he says, straining for submission. Quit trying to get your way. Quit trying to fight it. Quit trying to force your agenda. Quit trying to make everything work out the way you want it. And instead, submit to your wife. And if you look at those two lists, you might think, well, they're actually pretty similar. And they are. Because we're both sons and daughters of God. We're both trying to put Christ as our focus. But then he says, guys, there's a temptation there. There's a temptation. It's not because guys are better than or smarter than or anything else. It goes back to just genetics and physics. And he says, guys, because you're stronger, sometimes you tend to make this a mistake. You confuse strength as a way to get results. And I think if you look at the context of the Bible and what Peter writes throughout this whole letter, strength is for serving. Strength is for protecting, not enforcing. And he adds kind of a pretty heavy warning. He said, if that is present in your life, if you are abusing the ability that you have with physical strength, if you are taking advantage of that, not only is it killing your relationship with your spouse, it is blocking your relationship with God. Because you have a fundamental misunderstanding of why God gave you the strength that he did. And so he gives us a warning because, guys, it's so easy to fall into that, isn't it? That might makes right. To tell everybody in our house to man up, which was weird because I have a wife, 2 daughters, and 2 girl dogs. And you can't, who do you tell to man up, right? I mean, the point is the same as it is for wives. Put your identity and your focus and your attention into following Jesus. And everything changes. And here's my story. It's probably about 15 years ago. I was like a lot of guys. I went to work, worked hard, I did my best. I came home, and I was tired. And I wanted to play video games. And I wanted to watch TV. And I wanted somebody to just let me know when dinner was ready. Right? Sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Well, as you can imagine, that didn't go over well. Because my wife also worked. And I had 2 kids that were going to school. And they had things. And they had responsibilities. And they had stuff weighing on them. And when I came home and checked out, whether I really intended to or not, I sent them a message that said, none of what you're doing matters. None of what you're doing is important. What's important is me being able to do what I want. And I wasn't willing to sacrifice, in my mind, that time, that energy, that emotional engagement. Because, as I justified it, I had worked hard and I was tired. And I remember so clearly, and I'll be honest with you, this doesn't happen to me a lot, but I heard God speaking to me. And as I was driving home one day, I had had a really good day at work. And for some of you don't know, I was a pastor then too, okay? And just a lot of things that just happened that were so great. And I had opportunities to engage with so many people. And it was just, I was on a high, so to speak. And as I was driving home and I was kind of patting myself on the back, talking to God and like, hey, this is a pretty good day today, wasn't it? And he said, why will you serve all those other people but not the people in your family? And I literally turned off the radio and just drove home in silence. And I thought, you know, maybe this is your story too. There's so many people you encounter at work. Bosses, coworkers, clients, vendors, customers, people that walk in. And as I thought about it, I thought, you know, I'm so ready. I am so willing to jump and to help the people I don't even know. But I wasn't willing to sacrifice for my wife and my kids. And so as I came home, I decided, okay, I got to do something different. And I didn't get it right. It took some time, believe me. But I kind of made that mental decision. You know what? TV and the video games can wait. They can go away. They can be done with. And I started trying to engage, and I started trying to help my wife. And sometimes my help actually made things worse, you know what I mean? But I tried to help her, and I tried to help with dinner and help with the kids' homework and started really investing in all this stuff. And over time, it was amazing what happened. This little sacrifice of TV and video games created a great marriage. And I can't speak for my kids. I don't want to speak for them. And they didn't really buy in because over time, we started to give them chores so they could help out too, you know, which, by the way, if you're a parent, chores are great for kids. Let them be responsible and accountable or something. That's a good thing, not a bad thing. But we gave them chores. And I tried to convince them. I used to tell them, oh, no, it's not a chore. Because they would say, well, I got to go do my chores. No, it's not a chore. It's an opportunity to serve your family, you know. And then you got the eye roll and the hip kick because I got daughters and the whole thing, you know. But it did change our house, changed our relationships. And when I look back on that, I realized 2 things happened. 1, I grew closer to God because God told me to do something and I did it. And when you obey God, you draw closer to Christ. And 2, it drew me closer to my wife and drew our family in. It was an amazing thing, and my big sacrifice was TV and video games. And my big takeaway was a different marriage and a different going home every night. Maybe that's your situation, or maybe your situation is completely different. I don't know. But the reason why it's true goes back to Jesus. We see it on the cross, right? If you're a follower of Jesus, you know this. You can't really say you love if you're not willing to sacrifice. It is sacrifice that proves love is real. Anybody can say it. Anybody can give a card or write it down or, hey, love you too, great. It's when you actually sacrifice something that love shows up. And Jesus proves this in the ultimate way. He gives his life to cover our sins. He gives his life so that we could have life. You see, it's always, always, always been about giving it up. Because when we give up, it builds up. Now, there's a couple of things, couple of areas, specific areas within marriage where you really do have to focus on giving up. And I'll be honest with you, these are problem areas. They're so common, but they're kind of silent killers. And so I'm not up here to make you feel bad or convict you. That's the Holy Spirit's job, right? I'm here just to simply point out that so many marriages have these issues. And if it's in yours, the thing to do is not beat yourself up because it's in your marriage. The thing to do is to get help to get it out of your marriage, okay? So the first thing you got to do, the first thing you got to give up is you got to kick out the freeloaders. See, there's some marriage freeloaders that everybody seems to have. And freeloaders, you've heard the expression living rent-free in your head. This is exactly this idea, that it's something that's just kind of chewing up your mental energy and your emotional energy all the time. So what are they? What are the marriage freeloaders? 3 things: regret, resentment, and secrets are marriage freeloaders. And regret and resentment you probably get. If you're married to somebody that has a lot of regret, you know how that blocks the relationship. If you're married to somebody that has a lot of resentment in their life, whether it's towards you or other people or things or situations, you get how that can block things. And those 2 things have to be given up. You got to let go of that. But what about secrets? Because like I said, this is one I hear a lot. I'll say it this way. If you're married and one of you is keeping a secret, your spouse knows it. They absolutely know it. You know, well, how could they? That's a secret. Nobody knows. They may not know what the secret is, but they know that there is a secret. And here's the way that plays out, unfortunately. They know there is a secret. They don't know what it is, but they know there is a secret. And when they know that secret is out there, there's 2 things going off in their head. They don't trust me, and something hurtful is coming. And it makes your relationship sick. The longer the secret stays, the more it blocks progress in your marriage. And I know that for a lot of you think, yeah, but I can't tell my secret. I can't share that. I mean, they'd leave me, or this would blow up, or everything would be. And you know what? I cannot tell you what will happen. I'm not going to be able to predict that. But I do know this: that as long as the secret is there, the marriage will always be sick. And there are so many options. Again, like I said, you got a secret. Okay, fine. Let's admit that. Let's move forward. The foolish thing to do is pretend like nothing is wrong. There is something wrong. So the question is, what are you going to do about it? As a church, we want to stand by you. We absolutely do. It may be that it's just you and your spouse having a long, loving conversation and working through it. And if you can do that and that works out, that's great. It may be that you need some marriage mentors in your life. You need a couple to walk with you, and we have that. We've got couples in our church that have said, hey, we want to walk with other couples. We want to help. Maybe that's what you need. You say, no, it's bigger. It's really big. I mean, we need to get with professional help. We've got counselors here in the valley that love Jesus and want to see your marriage succeed, that we would love to connect you with, that they can professionally help you walk through the issue. But whatever it is, if there is a secret, you got to deal with it, because your marriage will be sick until you do. So you got to kick out the freeloaders. The second thing you got to do is give up the grudges. Give up the grudges. And this is all about forgiveness. And it could be that big thing that happened several years ago that still nobody has ever quite gotten over. Chances are that for most of us, it's those small day-to-day things. It's being inconsiderate. It's being thoughtless. It's insisting on your own way. It's refusing to apologize. It's not admitting that you were wrong. It's pretending like the other person, you didn't hear them and you're going to do it anyway. And it's all of those things that we do in a relationship because that's what we do. But here's the deal. Forgiveness is what draws you closer to Christ and draws you closer to each other. And so when you hold on to the grudge, much like keeping the secret, it just creates an artificial block in your relationship. And your relationship is never going to progress past that. But when you give up the grudge, all of a sudden, there's room to grow. It's about forgiving each other and granting forgiveness to each other. You might say, well, yeah, but you don't know. I mean, if I do that, they're going to walk over me, and I don't want to give that up, and I don't want to say. When you refuse to give up the grudge, you are instead choosing to block progress in your marriage. And here's something, and you know this, we've talked about it before. You realize that forgiveness, giving forgiveness, is actually for you. It's not for the other person. It changes your heart. It helps you heal. It helps you move forward. It makes you more like Christ. When you grant forgiveness, you are actually growing. The forgiveness that you're not willing to give is actually hurting you and imprisoning you instead of freeing you. It's not that you're giving the other person permission. It's not that you're allowing the other person to just do whatever they want. It's actually for you. When you forgive, it heals you. So you've got to give up the grudges. Marriage is about giving up. It's about sacrifice. And when you're both doing it, your marriage changes so much for the better. And here's what's amazing. Here's to me what makes this so impactful. You grow in your relationship with God. You grow in your marriage. And before you know it, the people around you see your life, they see your marriage, and they begin to wonder, what do they have? What's going on with them? Why do they seem to genuinely love each other? Why do they seem to genuinely care about each other? Why does it seem like they can handle whatever life throws at them? And then they begin to ask, and it gives you an opportunity to let your neighbors know, to let your friends know, let your family know. We've been intentional. We've built this thing on following Jesus, and it has changed everything. So what does life look like after I do? For the best marriages, notice I didn't say what everybody else does. For the best marriages, it means building it on Christ. Let's pray together.